As a brand, messaging is the words that you use to connect with your audience. The better the messages, the more chance you have of becoming a successful venture. So, Mark, g'day.
Dave, how are you?
Let's start with a bit of lesson time and
Sure.
explore messaging a bit.
Yep.
What is messaging? How do we make messages and where do we use them? So let's start with the what.
Yep.
What is messaging?
Yeah, I mean, for me, messaging is all about turning the personality and positioning of the brand into words, and key messages, obviously, hence the name. It sounds a lot like, well, that's just copywriting. Anyone can, put a few words down on paper, but it's a bit more than, just the words. A lot of it is actually the process of choosing what you're going to say, what themes are you covering, what's the hierarchy of messaging, that you're trying to convey, how all that fits together and is, I guess, put across, in sort of a complete brand story, or a platform of words and statements, I guess, that a brand can rally around.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as like a very deliberate, considered effort to think about what you're saying as a brand. And it could pertain to products or to your services, but you're making a very deliberate effort to make sure that you're messaging consistently right across all of your communications.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about consistency already on the pod, and if you don't have a messaging platform or you haven't done the work to shape your messaging, then yeah, you're gonna find that you end up just sort of a shotgun approach of random statements and that sort of thing. It won't be consistent, and
right, yeah.
You won't be able to rally behind it.
So you kind of get this meandering, really, in your communications.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges with messaging, or for any brand, what they're trying to say is there's so many different things that you could say.
Right.
Like if you ask any brand owner or business owner, like, okay, tell us about your business. What are the key things? They'll rattle off 10, 20 different things, and especially for them, because they're so involved in it and passionate about it, they know all the detail, like they want to talk about everything, and so if you've got this, like, if there's no framework to pull that all together or whatever, then every time you're out there you could be saying a different message, or even just end up with like reams and reams of copy. We see this all the time on websites and stuff where you're just trying to say too much, and so that's definitely the downside if you don't get it right.
Yeah, because you I mean, I guess as a single like founder, one person in the business, you're the first person to start the company, and a lot of it is kind of like your thoughts, your mindset, your approach to the market. Like messaging is almost less of a risk at that stage, but as you grow as a company, you get to 5 people, 10 people, 15, and then you grow past 100.
Yeah,
messaging takes on a whole other level of importance as well.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think too that's one of the biggest benefits that you gain out of like sitting down and actually mapping out what your messaging should look like is clarity. Like it's clarity and confidence in, okay, well, this is what we're going to say and this is how we're going to say it, because and that clarity is both a benefit for the stuff that you put out there into the world. So like we talked about consistency already, but having that clarity of like, oh, okay, this is what this brand is trying to say. It's really clear. I can understand it. It's simple. But that clarity piece comes back internally as well, So then everyone in the team, like you're talking about, from person 1 to 20, 50, 100, they get that clarity too of like, okay, well, this is how I should talk about the brand. This is what it means. These are the kind of words that we would use. This is, how I describe what we do and why it's different to somebody else.
Yeah, so it's not just externally what we're trying to push across to our audience, but it's critically important for the internal audience,
exactly.
Your team, your staff, as you say.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about other upsides, I mean, what's the end game with messaging? Like, why do we do it at all, even?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, it's, the idea of a brand story, I guess, gets thrown around a lot, can come off a bit hoity-toity for a lot of companies. You might think, oh, that's not for me, I don't need a fancy brand story, but the nuts and bolts of it is just sort of clearly articulating a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about, like what do we do, how do we do it differently, you know, and why you should care about it. Like it's some combination of those things, and for every brand that's different. You know, some will focus more on the benefits and the outcomes, other will focus more on features of a product, for example, and other, you know, brands will have a more, you know, elaborate why or passionate why, so that will come more to the fore. And certainly that's a big key part of the process of messaging, is determining what that hierarchy is. You know, again, we talk about that idea of 100 different things to say. Well, the process of messaging is, you know, whittling that down, identifying themes, you know, that some of those statements can fall under, and trying to get to a place where you can communicate all the good parts, but in a really simple sort of outcome. So yeah, it's really just like making sure that, you know, in a really simple way, what's great about your business is clear and communicated to the market, you know, and internally, like we talked about. But it's that cut through for me. You know? Like there's, again, and if there's 10 things that are great that you could say about your business, probably 2 of them are really important. If you try and say all 10, you know, it's going to get a bit lost. Whereas, you know, rallying around the right things and, you know, that sort of thing, you know, it just creates that cut through, which I think is so key. Yeah,
I mean, like you say, I mean, that clarity piece is so important. I guess you look at all the best brands from around the world, and the ones that are really winning are the ones that are saying it the clearest.
Yeah, for sure.
Like they have that clear message which just resonates with that customer, because they know that customer so well. Yeah. They know themselves well, but they also know their customer well. And when you can get that match that happens in between with the way you message.
Yeah. That's where like those insights and strategy piece that we talked about before really comes through, you know, in developing something like messaging, because as you say, it's got to be a message that is authentic and comes from a true place for the brand, but then also is a message that the customer cares about, you know. Like, because again, it's no good even if it sounds great or you think it's funny. Like, you know, I think that's a trap that people fall into with messaging and key statements, is they'll latch onto something like humor, but they won't really necessarily think about, is that communicating, you know, something great about the brand, and is it something that the customer can get excited about?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually kind of a nice little segue into how we actually make messages, and that's one of the difficult things for brands, right? Is to well, as you say, is like find the right messages, because you could be saying 20 things. But also the second part of that is like, but what if those 20 things are really average things? Like, how do we know, and how do we make them? How do we make messages? And I think we've kind of talked about this in other podcasts, because it does have lineage right back down to the strategy piece. But I mean, how do you go about it? I think starting with insights is always where we try and find that magic. You know, because I think as well that gets you towards more the unique things. Like, you know, we sort of see, I guess, an insight as some sort of unique nugget, you know, that we're listening out for when we're talking to a brand, like a fresh way to look at things, or something that they're doing differently. You know, we talked a lot about differentiation last pod, and just sort of honing in on those things that really stand out as aha kind of moments. But really, you know, the other part of insights is that customer focus, you know, like, okay, what is it about this thing that we're trying to say that, you know, is actually beneficial to the customer? Because that's ultimately what it's really got to be all about. So it definitely starts with, you know, those insights. And then I think it becomes then, I guess, about aligning, you know, words and messages around those. But as we said before, it's like, what are the key sort of themes and ways that you can align ideas? You know, we often see, I reckon, if there's, say, 20 things that you want to say, you can actually go through all those different things and identify, well, these actually fall under these 3 or 4, you know, umbrella kind of themes or topics. You know, they're sort of different features or benefits, but they actually sort of have this same through line. So we definitely find that's a way to dwindle down more to the key points. You know, it's like looking at something that you might say and often thinking, okay, well, what are you really trying to say? You know, what's the... You know, you talk about a feature of a product. Well, what are you really trying to say? You know, oh, it gets your work done faster. Okay, well, let's talk about that. You know, or if there's 3 or 4 features that talk about getting your work done faster, then that getting your work done faster is the actual message you're trying to convey, not the
the features sort of thing. So it's that pattern matching comes into play a lot.
And if we were to pull the curtain back a little bit, and it was like you're a fly on the wall in one of our strategy sessions, I mean, what that kind of looks like, right, is we've got a group of people in a room. It's rarely just one person. It's usually a group of people, which is an interesting challenge for messaging, generally speaking, because you have different perspectives. Yeah. But also that can bring sort of that roundedness to the way that you craft messages. Yeah. But what else happens in those meetings, like to pull out those insights?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a few different ways, but I mean, one of the most interesting is often, the story time, where we just kind of get the brand, people involved in the brand, I guess, just to tell us, the stories that stand out for them about great interactions they've had, or really successful times, or just the things that have gone great. Often it's more when someone's not consciously trying to come up with a key message, and they're actually just talking about why they're passionate about the brand, or something great that's happened. We'll be listening there, to grab those sound bites.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, it's like those turn of phrases sometimes that are really interesting, like that form actually the baseline to a lot of our messaging. Yeah. And we often say like the answers reside within the client's mind, but it's actually just kind of getting it down in a room, like getting them to say it, and getting them to get into that flow of talking about their business or their mission or their why or the opportunity that's ahead of them.
Yeah, I mean,
that
you definitely
kind of yields the interesting stuff.
Yeah, you almost find that often comes more towards the end when you think you've already.
Yeah, how often have we been in one of those meetings where it's like the last 5 minutes is like where the gold comes?
Yeah, because you sort of, I guess at that point you're starting to get maybe beyond the obvious stuff that when you think of your business, you kind of rattle off the ticky sort of checklist. Yeah. And then once you maybe let that guard down and you're just more broadly talking, that you get to some of that insight.
We talked about in some of the earlier pods about personality and tone, and we kind of touched on that. But how does that impact on messaging, and why does that even matter?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like to draw the line then from the getting those insights to what you're talking about, is the other thing to me about those initial meetings is it's almost like the more you get down, the better. Like it's contrary to the idea of getting to a simple clarity point at the end, but it's sort of getting everything out, getting everything down, and then we go away and go through that process of synthesizing that and pattern matching all that, coming up with those insights, and then from there, to me, it's okay, well, we've taken these insights. You're then looking to match them to that personality, and tone of voice that we talked about before. And then, this is, one of the highest forms of personification, I guess, of that, positioning work that we've done to get to this point, is that will completely inform, the actual copywriting style and the words that you craft. Is it humorous because the brand has a, humorous personality? Is it more authoritative, because again, that's the brand personality that you're looking to portray. It's, again, like we talk with everything, it's got to line up, everything that we're doing is trying to line up behind the same strategy and get that consistency and clarity.
Yeah, and I think hierarchy definitely, has a role to play in all of this as well too. I mean, we touched on this earlier in the chat about how it's not the 20 messages, it's the 2 messages that are probably going to be the ones that really, really hit. Yeah. When it comes to hierarchy, how do you figure out like what are the most important messages?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, it's probably different every time, Getting to a really simple list of, let's only say these 4 or 5 things is really hard, and often something that, a business owner or a brand manager or whatever might struggle with a little bit too when we, first present it back to them. But hopefully they can already start to see why we've rallied around those ones. I mean, it often, I guess to me, comes out quite clearly, okay, well, this thing here is either really the most different thing about this business, or this is where they deliver the most value, in what they're doing, that it just sort of, it starts to stand out. Or sometimes you can get one of those themes that we talked about that is just, is really nicely all-encompassing, so it actually touches on everything else, and you do get this hierarchy that almost looks like an org chart where you just have this one thing right there at the center, and then all these other messages just sort of fall in nicely underneath that. They're really just reinforcing that same main point. And certainly, again, I would say that customer importance and focus plays into that hierarchy too, so we often want that main message or two to be very customer focused, and why does the brand exist, but why does that then matter to the customer?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think too is when you do kind of start to zero on in that one key message, or even if it's just a handful, maybe you're down to your 3 or 5 messages that are really strong, that you think strong. I mean, there's always that testing piece as well, where you can put it in front of a test group and find out, does that message hit? Do you get it? Do you understand it?
Yeah.
Is it saying the right thing?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, comprehension is such a big part of it too, especially if you do have a brand that has, say, a quirky personality, so you write some quirky messaging, but you've still got to make sure that the key point is actually getting through, it can sound great, but if it's not achieving the original goal of actually saying, well, this is, what this brand is about, then, all the quirkiness in the world is kind of lost or loses its meaning.
Now, it's probably a big missed opportunity not to talk about the role of copywriting in messaging.
Yep.
And there is a slight distinction between messaging and copywriting, but a copywriter, as in the person that's kind of responsible for the task of creating the messages.
Yep.
It's such a critical role, both internally, if you're fortunate enough to be able to nest a copywriter within your business, can make a huge impact. But the role of the copywriter in messaging is so critical.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. They're delivering the end result, they can have all the raw source material in the world, but, you've still got to execute. It's the same thing for us in design as well. There's such a disparity between okay average design and great design, and the same is true for copywriting as it relates to messaging. I think the distinction really is just that copywriting is a component of messaging. That's really what we're saying, in terms of there's so much else that goes into creating great messaging other than just the copywriting, but the flip side of that is it is still copy that needs to be written and written well,
Yeah, absolutely. In kind of thinking through this chat before, in just kind of some warm-up thoughts before I got here, I banged out 6 rules for great messaging or for great copywriting.
Hey, mummy.
All right, so rule number 1 is you want cut through.
Yeah.
And you want to get to the point pronto.
Sure.
I think that's rule number 1, right? You really want that. We were talking about cut through before, but just getting to the point.
Yeah.
Is critical, I think, for great messaging.
Well, that's the thing. It's it seems a bit redundant to say it over and over, but that simplicity piece is the hardest part. Turning what a business owner might say in 100 words down into 5 or 6. That is a really tricky part, but it is so crucial because that's the attention grabbing bit. But you want to grab attention and communicate within that same, 5-6 words. It's not
an easy task. Yeah. No, exactly right. Okay, rule number 2 is copy that comes at the subject from the customer's point of view, because quite often we're coming from our business stance, our point of view on things. And I think you want an element of that, but you also want to gut check that from a customer's perspective as well too.
Absolutely. Yep.
Rule number 3, so use familiar language and plain speak, as we kind of call it, and remove the jargon wherever you can.
For sure. Yeah. Again, that comes back to that simplicity side of things as well, and really keeping the customer in mind. It's interesting. We definitely almost always use that rule of trying to get rid of the jargon. I mean, sometimes it's worth having some technical inclusions in copy, but we usually even find that comes more in the depth, or the longer form. Usually the messaging platform should be pretty jargon free.
Number 4, informal. Is more human. It doesn't work in all circumstances.
Sure.
There is times where you do need to be a bit more professional, possibly. But where possible, I think you want to try and keep it informal. You want to keep the language relaxed.
Yeah. I mean, I think another way to say that really is just authentic.
Authentic. Yeah, that's a great way.
And we find that most brands do want to have a human or a relatable aspect to it, which is why I think, as you're saying, most of the time it is better to be, that bit more informal or just honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Rule 5, be original. It's a tough one, but originality is a critical component, I think, to great messaging. There's messaging and then there's great messaging, and I think the scale is largely dictated by how original the content is.
Well, I think that aligns very much with, again, our differentiation chat from last week about positioning. It's, if you've got a more unique brand position, of course, then what you say is going to be more unique. So, I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
I definitely agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final rule, the last one, is messaging that hits the heart, gets the emotional trigger point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a stretch goal. I mean, it's not always possible,
Yeah.
but the ones that like hit you in the heart, they're the best messages.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, if that's tied to, things we talked about in the past, it's, have you got a why that is a motive, a reason that you do it, or an outcome, for those involved with whatever you're doing that is a motive, then that's very powerful for sure.
Absolutely. All right, so we've gone through kind of the process of how to actually craft messages and why it's important. But once we've got them, like, where do we practically put them, and like, where do they manifest, and what are all the areas that they can reach into? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the short answer is everywhere. Really.
Right.
Like, in the same way that we might, you might think about your visual identity for a brand, and that's gonna, or should, for those consistency reasons that we've talked about, become the way that you're seen visually everywhere. To me, your messaging, becomes that foundation for everything that you say. That's one of the, I guess, those biggest key takeaways that we always see from a messaging project, is that it gives these brands something foundational and long lasting, that they can, be riffing on for years to come. The words itself might change, but that sort of framework of aligning the positioning with the tone of voice and the personality, we have brands that are still, using the same, essentially the same statements we wrote 5 years ago, still in their social posts today, because you've tapped into really what they're all about and what they're offering. So that, it just gives you this really long lasting foundation of things to say. So it ends up everywhere, your website, what you say on social. But if it's done well, and if you create like quite a good messaging guide, I guess, for a brand, then they can also use that to then write their own copy. It should even manifest itself in how they write emails to customers and those sorts of things. Like, essentially every time they're out there, sales materials, pitch materials, your website, obviously, brochures, whatever, but they should all be, I guess, aligning back to this hierarchy and foundation that we've created. Yeah,
it's a really good point, even like down to the email level. Like, I love that sort of getting down to the weeds, the detail around that. But it actually reminds me of a conversation I had earlier this week with a customer that we're just about to do a project with, and we were talking about the messaging hierarchy and framework, and how that would impact the way that they do video, because they're about to go and shoot a whole bunch of coaching videos.
Yeah, exactly.
And they wanted to make sure that they were on message.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is to actually kind of reference back the framework.
Yeah.
And make sure, even when you're doing a 2-camera piece, for example, that it's kind of referencing back. It's not to say that you're robotic about it. But,
well, I think the key part of that too is like 80-90% of what they actually say, the words that they say in that video, won't be something we've already written, but because they have that messaging framework, they'll know the themes that they should be talking about, the types of words they should be using, the tone of voice that they should have. Again, is it quirky, is it serious, is it playful?
Right, because if the brand is about fun, but they're coming across as really serious, you've got a bit of a fail point there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing, why the messaging is so powerful, and where it's very different, say, to copywriting for a campaign, where it's just, okay, this is the marketing campaign and it's going to last for 3 months and these are the exact words, and it might be a singular great idea. Like messaging should be further reaching than that, more all encompassing, so that, as you say, they might be completely coming up with all new content for that video, but it's all referencing back to these same themes, the same sort of hierarchy, the same tone of voice that we've developed through messaging.
All right, change of pace.
Yeah.
What happens? What happens when things go wrong in messaging? And they can go wrong.
Yeah. I saw an example driving down to the coast this morning today.
Yeah. What was it?
Well, it was a personal injury law firm.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe not always the best bastions of brand. But basically, it was just a billboard that just said "Hit happens."
Right.
So obviously, kind of funny. You know, obviously playing off "shit happens."
Yeah.
You know, I guess trying to tap into that idea that, you know, bad stuff happens, so go see your lawyer. But to me, it was such a good example of a bad example, and elaborating on that, really, it's like when you have messaging that's really thin or one-dimensional, you know, like what they've done there is they played on humour, you know, and it might be somewhat memorable or whatever, and, you know, there's a lot of brand theory out there of like, if you associate yourself with humour, it's more memorable, it rubs off on your brand as a more positive perception, but there's really nothing more to it than it's just kind of funny.
Right.
It doesn't tell me anything unique about the brand. It doesn't tell me any benefit that I'm going to get out of it. You know, there's nothing more to it than just it's clever.
Right, yeah.
You know, so that kind of idea of like using humour is great, but, you know, where we see good messaging is where you're actually tying that to a more meaningful message, you know, not just sort of just tapping into humour.
Yeah, gotcha. So there's layers to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, other problems, you know, if it isn't authentic, if it doesn't match your brand personality, you know, we've talked a lot about that before, and, you know, again, if you're going out there with quirky messaging, but then you meet the person in person and they're as dry as, you know, as it comes, you know, so you want that messaging that you're putting out there to be reflective of the brand, and for that, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so that's on the bad side of the ledger. On the good side of the ledger, the one that comes to mind for me of doing a great job of messaging is Allbirds. Mm-hmm. So Allbirds is the footwear brand. I think you actually got a pair of those, or a couple of pairs.
Yes, I love them.
So, I mean, killer styles. So, I mean, they create beautiful shoes, but they've got an interesting story because they're made from recycled bottles, castor bean oil. I'm not even sure how they use that.
My shoes are made out of wool.
Wool, yeah. Recycled cardboard. And then they call that, well, the wool is called Trino, which is their own trademarked name for super wool.
Oh, so, I didn't even know that. Yeah. Super wool shoes.
Yeah, so super wool. And so that in itself is an interesting messaging piece around materials, and that's a lot of that's got to do with brand positioning as well, too, and ethos and mission. But to me, it's a good example of messaging, not so much for the point of view that it references one core message, but I think what they've done is they've created a framework where if you look on their website, for example, there's simple language, so that's a consistent theme that runs through it. There's this positive undertones through all the copywriting, and so you come away with like this really upbeat vibe. And then there's just this peppering of good use of words that are not so common, like in the lexicon of footwear sold online. Yeah. So it's a bit surprising, but they're very consistent across the whole spectrum.
Yeah. So do you think that those unique words make you sort of pay more attention to what they're saying?
I think they do, yeah. They do. And it gives them a certain style about the way they message. Yeah. So they've used messaging in a different way, but still consistent with what we've been talking about today, in the sense of there's a framework. There's actually, you can see that they could hand a brief to a copywriter if they had the messaging framework and be able to work within that to create, great
something that sounds like them.
Yeah, that sounds like them. Exactly right. Yeah. I mean, any other examples that come to mind that we can talk through?
Yeah, I mean, one I really like is Campo's coffee. So I'm a coffee addict.
Yeah. How many today?
I don't want to say. If I sound hypo, you know why.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, their positioning, is really, I guess, around, it sort of first started around quality, and that's nothing new, I guess, in coffee now, but they were certainly one of the first to really go out there and I guess show the quality and craft behind coffee. But that's really evolved into this idea that they have now, a tagline, if you like, of cultivated by good, And to me, what's quite interesting about it is that they sort of say that coffee only tastes good if it's made ethically and with care. And what I like about that is obviously there is I guess a social aspect to it, the ethical side of it. So they put a lot of work, through their messaging and visuals and that sort of thing, of showing that they go all the way back to the source of where the coffee comes from. They get to know the farmers. They're making sure that these are ethical farms where every single bean is coming from, and they know the source of the coffee. And so there's that social and ethical aspect of it. But then, the and with care part on the end is, talking to their craft as coffee people. They're putting a lot of care into what they're doing.
Yeah.
They only use the best baristas and the best milk, and, making sure that everything in that whole process is done with care. So you get this really nice sort of double meaning, of cultivated by good. It's the care factor for the people involved and the ethical side, but then the care factor for the product and the outcome and the quality itself. It just all ties together really nicely, with this, projects this really, sort of premium brand feel, and again, sort of gives you some of those good vibes that you were talking about before.
Yeah, nice. So that's a good example.
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right. Well, I reckon that's a good place to wrap up today.
Yeah, positive note to end on.
Yeah, positive note to end on. That's cool. So, yeah, good chat. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave. Cheers.
Cheers.